The gown was ivory satin, stitched by moonlight and silence, and hung like a breath over the dressing form. Lydia adjusted the hem with steady fingers, though her mind drifted elsewhere, somewhere far beyond the grand chamber walls and the perfume-soaked air of the Duchess to Be's quarters. Her cap sat tightly over her neat braids, her dress plain and without flourish, the uniform of someone meant to vanish behind her duties. And she had vanished. 12 years beneath the household's gaze. 12 years as a fixture in the background, always near silk but never allowed to wear it. She was the lady's maid now, assigned to Miss Eugenia Claremont, the young beauty from Hampshire who was to become the Duchess of Halverton by week's end. A fine match, they said, a brilliant elevation, and Lydia once more was expected to lace the back of another woman's fortune. The Halverton estate pulsed with preparation. Footmen darted like shadows through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, maids whispered behind copper pans in the kitchen, and out on the south lawn, musicians rehearsed delicate notes that would float over champagne flutes and carefully managed laughter. But in the upper west wing, where the bride resided, tension clung like damp linen. Eugenia, with her butter-blonde curls and lemon-drop laugh, had been kind to Lydia at first, playfully instructing her on her preferred tea, allowing her to sit for 5 minutes between corset fastenings. But as the wedding approached, the air between them cooled. A cruel edge emerged in the young lady's voice, as though marriage had bestowed power prematurely. Lydia understood. Brides, especially wealthy ones, grew sharp when they sensed the world watching. Still, it was not Eugenia's cruelty that unsettled Lydia tonight. It was the letter. A folded thing she had slipped into a book years ago, a letter she had written in foolish, unguarded youth, sealed in her own hand, addressed not to the Duke, but to Thomas, before titles, before fate. She'd never meant to send it. Yet last night in the Duke's study, among a pile of papers to be cleared for the coming ceremony, she had seen it, familiar ink, familiar fold, slid between sheets of guest arrangements and estate holdings. Her heart had caught, violently. He had kept it. 12 years ago she'd written of her departure, of her shame, of a moment between them that had passed like breath on glass. She was the steward's daughter then. He was simply Thomas, the second son. That moment, brief as it was, had left her life changed, and seemingly not forgotten. She hadn't told a soul. Now, in the glow of a chandelier heavy with crystal and expectation, Lydia knelt to adjust a shoe buckle, and Eugenia yawned. "Try not to tug, Lydia, I have a headache." Lydia murmured an apology. Below bells rang, a carriage arrived. Guests. The house swelled with promise. And in the silence of her thoughts, Lydia felt it, like a shiver pressed against the spine. Something was about to change. Something old and buried was pushing toward the light. The garden reception that followed was intended to be a vision of harmony. Tables draped in lace beneath flowering trellises, servants bearing silver trays with clinking glasses, and string quartets tucked behind sculpted hedges. Every guest wore the season's pastel, as though defiance of convention might summon poor weather. Yet the sky remained obstinately perfect, a blue so untroubled it seemed almost mocking. Lydia stood behind Eugenia's chair, close enough to adjust a shawl, far enough to be invisible. The young bride-to-be giggled at something Lord Moresby whispered into her ear. Her gloved fingers toyed absently with a cherry stem, eyes never once turning toward Lydia, though Lydia had been the one to dress her that morning, to soothe her bout of nausea, to tighten the fine corset that made breathing something the bride would now have to plan in advance. "Oh, Miss Claremont," Lady Howarth trilled, dabbing at her powdered cheek with a lace handkerchief, "you shall be the most radiant Duchess Halverton has ever known." "Let us hope," Eugenia answered, smiling so sweetly the lie nearly passed as truth. The gathered guests laughed, though none too loudly. No one ever wished to draw more attention than the bride. The Duke, late to arrive, had not yet joined them. Whispers fluttered at his absence. "Perhaps he has cold feet," someone murmured. "Don't be absurd. Dukes don't fret." Lydia moved as needed, passing, collecting, adjusting. She offered more wine to the groom's aunt, retrieved a fallen fan, and received neither thanks nor acknowledgement. The lace cuff of her dress was damp where she had cleaned a spilled cordial. She felt the wet fabric cling to her skin. It reminded her she was real, alive, even if no one looked at her directly. Then a laugh, sharp and close. Eugenia had turned to her finally. "Lydia, you must forgive me. I simply must tell them. Lady Howarth, listen to this." She leaned conspiratorially toward the circle of women. "This morning, poor Lydia mistook a sachet of lavender for powdered chalk and nearly set my décolletage ablaze." Delicate laughter ensued. Lydia blinked. She hadn't. "She turned the loveliest shade of puce, didn't she?" Eugenia went on, sipping wine. "My poor maid, dreadfully devoted but tragically absent-minded." The women tittered again. Lydia's spine straightened with the precision of something long trained into obedience. Her lips did not part. She did not smile. It was a fabrication. Harmless, perhaps, but deliberate. A dressing down wrapped in charm. A game that the privileged played when they sensed they were being watched and needed to shine. Lydia's hands folded at her waist. She said nothing. She was not meant to speak unless asked. But behind her stillness her thoughts flared. Because the moment the Duke appeared, stepping onto the garden path in his dark coat, the sun slicing against his temple, every murmur quieted. Heads turned. And in that breathless hush, as Eugenia's eyes glowed with pleasure at his approach, Lydia caught his glance. It was brief, startling. He had looked past the bride, past the crowd, straight to where Lydia stood. And there was recognition there, not of a servant, not of someone invisible, but of someone remembered. It lasted less than a heartbeat. And then he smiled for Eugenia, bowed to the guests and said something dashing about how no one had prepared him for how beautiful a garden might look once filled with admirers. The moment passed, but the air was different now. The garden held its breath. Lydia adjusted Eugenia's shawl once more, and for the first time since arriving, she did not feel ashamed to touch fine silk. 12 years ago, the world had smelled of horses and crushed rosemary. It had rained that spring, the kind of steady, stubborn rain that blurred the line between sky and earth, and the estate had been quieter then, less grand, less crowded. The old Duke was still alive, bitter and full of threats, and Thomas was merely the second son, bright-eyed, impulsive, and frequently punished for both. Lydia had been 16, her father the steward, her mother long buried beneath the linden trees in the churchyard beyond the stables. There had been a moment, just one. He had wandered into the old library, soaked through from riding, his boots trailing mud across the faded Aubusson rug. Lydia had been kneeling at the hearth, polishing the brass fireguard, the scent of beeswax in her sleeves. She ought to have fled the moment he entered. Servants were not meant to remain in the presence of gentlemen. But Thomas had waved her off, laughing, calling her Miss Candlelight, because her hair caught the flames. "I tire of being looked at with expectation," he'd said suddenly, sitting heavily in the old green chair. "I wish someone would see me like you do when you think I don't notice." She hadn't known what to say. And then he had apologized, for frightening her, for being presumptuous. But his eyes had not left her face. He'd asked about her reading, her family, her thoughts on poetry. No one had ever asked those things before. That night she wrote him a letter. It was clumsy, too intimate, and utterly naive. She hadn't signed it. She'd never sent it. But the next morning, a housemaid had found it wedged behind a curtain in the library, and by nightfall her father was dismissed from the estate without explanation. They were gone by week's end. No carriage sent, no compensation, no farewell. The letter, her letter, had been used as evidence of impropriety, whispered between the senior staff, held in trembling hands by the housekeeper as Lydia packed her father's satchel. "You've embarrassed him," the woman hissed, clutching the folded paper like a holy relic. "Embarrassed the boy. Your father's lucky he wasn't dragged before the magistrate." Lydia had never known if Thomas saw the letter, if he had read it, if he had even known what had caused her family's quiet erasure. Until yesterday, the sight of that envelope, aged, familiar, still sealed in the Duke's study, had struck her like the toll of a long-forgotten bell. He had kept it, all these years. She had wandered the corridors after that discovery, unsettled. The marble underfoot felt colder, the paintings more watchful. Every voice sounded like it came from a deeper room. She remembered the way Thomas had spoken to her, not like a servant, but like someone whose thoughts held worth. And she remembered how quickly that illusion had collapsed. Now he was a duke, the heir his father had never wanted, but whom fate had crowned anyway. And she was back, in his house, folding linens and arranging the buttons on his bride's gloves. Except something had shifted. In the garden his eyes had found her, not with guilt, but with memory, and perhaps something more dangerous. Understanding. The morning after the garden reception, the estate woke to the murmur of rain against the windows and the hiss of coal fires being stirred to life. The housemaids moved softly, polishing sconces and sweeping ash, as though careful not to disturb the breathless quiet that had settled over Halverton Hall. Somewhere bells chimed the hour. 7. Lydia had risen before the chimes. She always did. The bridal gown awaited final fittings. Fresh ribbons were to be chosen for the flower girls. A jeweled comb was missing. Eugenia insisted it had been misplaced, and the blame had already begun to circle among the staff. Lydia had taken it upon herself to search the eastern drawing room. That was what she told the butler, and what she told herself as she stepped once more into the Duke's study. The letter was no longer visible. The desk, so cluttered the day before, had been tidied with almost suspicious care. Guest lists stacked by surname, wax seals arranged in a neat row, an ink blotter aligned precisely with the edge of the writing surface. Lydia did not touch anything. She merely stood near the window and glanced outward, watching as a lone rider crossed the field beyond the orchard. A knock startled her, not at the door, at the window. She turned sharply. Outside, beneath the bare-leafed elm, stood Hannah, the old seamstress who had once worked beside her mother. She wore a brown cloak and a determined look, holding something wrapped in oilcloth. Lydia hurried downstairs, heart thudding, slipping past the footman engaged in polishing the banister. She found Hannah in the side courtyard, out of sight. "He gave me this," Hannah said without preamble. "A fortnight past. Said if you came back here, and if you looked like you remembered anything, I was to give it to you." Lydia unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was a small velvet box, and beneath it a folded note, different paper. A man's hand. "I was 17. I should have spoken, but fear makes cowards of those raised to inherit. If you are reading this, then you remember too. I do not expect forgiveness, only understanding. Th. Thomas Halverton." The box contained a brooch, her mother's, a mourning piece, black enamel and seed pearls, stolen the day they were dismissed. She had believed it lost forever. Lydia closed the box slowly. Something old was stirring, something he had chosen to awaken, and if he believed a letter and a brooch could undo a decade of silence, he was mistaken. But he had reached out. That, in itself, was enough to crack the edges of the life she had built from submission. That evening, while Eugenia bathed and the housemaids bickered over spilled powder, Lydia sat at the tiny desk in her quarters and began to write. Not a love letter, not a confession, a statement. She addressed it to Mr. Martin Ellery, solicitor of Ellery and Sons in Mayfair, a discreet man once recommended by her father, who had helped distant cousins reclaim a disputed inheritance. Lydia had no property, no title, but she had memory, and she had questions, namely, why had the steward's daughter been cast out for impropriety when no accusation had ever been made publicly? Who had sanctioned her father's dismissal without process? And who had sealed away a letter that might have destroyed a future duke? It was time someone else asked the questions aloud. She sealed the envelope with wax and passed it to a scullery maid bound for the village. "Deliver this to the post," she whispered, "and speak of it to no one." The girl nodded, wide-eyed. By midnight, the letter was gone, and Lydia returned to her duties with a calm so deep it seemed like still water, dangerous, precise, waiting. She began to plan the bride's wedding veil the next day, but she also began to listen. She noticed the way the Duke avoided Eugenia's touch, the way he spoke of their future with studied cheer, never passion. She noticed how the butler winced when Lydia passed, as if reminded of something uncomfortable. And she noticed a stable boy, a quiet boy named Kit, who left a folded note near her tea tin one morning. 2 words. He knows. That was all, but it was enough. It was during the rehearsal dinner, a formal affair disguised as an intimate gathering, that the seams of Halverton's grandeur began to loosen. The guests were fewer in number, but higher in rank. Dukes, viscounts, and the Countess of Rothshire herself, all seated beneath a canopy of gold silk in the east dining hall, where candles cast long shadows on oil paintings and the scent of roasted pheasant mingled with rosewater. Crystal clinked, toasts were made, laughter rose like steam, and at the centre of it all sat the bride, blooming in her seafoam satin, and the Duke ever composed beside her, his smile impeccably timed. Lydia stood behind Eugenia as always, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. But her ears, listening. So when Lord Beckwith, known for his fondness of mischief and drink, raised his glass for a final toast, the hush was expectant. "To the soon-to-be Duchess of Halverton," he began, his speech thick with claret, "who brings grace, charm, and an estate in Kent, large enough to house 3 governments and a mistress or 2, should the Duke ever be so inclined." The room burst into tight laughter. The Duke chuckled politely. Eugenia flushed. Beckwith turned, emboldened. "But let us not forget the past, my friends. For every Duke has his youthful indiscretions, some flirtation in the library, some pretty face below his station. Thay Halverton." Silence. The smile faded from Thomas Halverton's face. He set his glass down very carefully. "I do not recall inviting ghosts to supper," he said quietly. But it was too late. The Countess of Rothshire turned to her husband with a whisper. The Viscount murmured something to his daughter. Faces shifted, postures stiffened. The air trembled with sudden tension, and then, like a stone dropped into a still pond, it happened. A letter, hand-delivered by the butler to the Duke. No fanfare, no announcement, just a discreet nod of folded parchment and the trembling of fingers as it passed from hand to hand. Thomas looked at it. The seal, Ellery and Sons, broke with a soft crack. He read, and something in his jaw twitched. Eugenia leaned forward. "Darling, what is it?" He did not answer. Instead, he stood. "Forgive me," he said to the room, "but this demands my immediate attention." Eugenia's voice lifted, feathered with panic. "Thomas?" He did not turn back. The guests, confused and murmuring, looked to one another for guidance. Then quietly another hand reached across the table. The Duke's aunt, an elegant woman with ash-grey hair and the sharp gaze of one who had endured 3 generations of scandal, lifted a second letter, smaller, unsealed. "I believe this may concern the same matter," she said. Eugenia took it, frowning, unfolded it, and her face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that cracked, hard and loud behind her eyes. She looked up slowly and turned toward Lydia. "You," she said, voice thin with horror. This is about you." Lydia did not move. Eugenia stood, the chair scraping loudly behind her. She held the letter aloft as if it were a blade. "My fiancé kept a letter from her for 12 years, she cried. "And now he has summoned legal counsel to discuss her father's dismissal. This is absurd. This is—" She faltered. The guests were utterly still. Lydia, standing behind her as always, stepped forward, not much, only inches, but enough that the space between them became something charged. "I wrote the letter," she said softly. The room gasped. "But I was not the one who buried it." The silence was complete. Even the musicians had stopped. Eugenia shook her head slowly, as though trying to banish a dream. "This is madness. He loves me. He—" "Perhaps," Lydia said, voice even. "But he also remembers." A single glass fell from someone's hand, the chime of it startling as it shattered. In that moment Lydia understood. The lie was no longer sealed behind study doors or brushed beneath velvet carpets. It was now in the room, spoken, seen, and no one dared look away. The Countess was the first to recover. Her silver fork, half lifted to her lips, was laid down with the poise of a seasoned tactician. "This is neither the time nor the place," she murmured, a thin smile drawn across her pale face. "Whatever grievance has passed between servant and master, it is surely beneath public airing." But the air had already thickened. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between Lydia and the bride, between the shattered glass and the door through which the Duke had vanished. Servants at the edge of the room stood frozen, uncertain whether to clear plates or flee. Eugenia's composure fractured. "He had no right," she hissed, the letter crumpling in her gloved fist. "No right to keep such a thing, to lie to me, to let her linger in this house like some ghost." Lydia remained still. The Viscount leaned in, eyes narrowed. "What exactly does this letter say?" The Countess replied without turning. "It is a personal matter, best handled privately." "No," Eugenia snapped. "Let them all hear it. She was dismissed for impropriety, her father ruined because she fancied herself in love with a boy far above her station. And now she returns to haunt his marriage with old letters and insinuations." Lydia's voice cut through the din, not loud but iron-bound. "My father was dismissed without cause, without charge, because a letter I never sent was found, a letter that was used not as proof of a crime, but as pretext for shame." Several guests inhaled sharply. Eugenia rounded on her. "You seduced him." "I was 16. The words dropped like lead. The Countess's fan stilled mid-wave. The Viscount's fingers tightened around his glass. No one breathed. "I was 16, Lydia repeated. "And he was 17. There was no seduction. There was only conversation. One stolen hour in a library that cost my family everything." A chair scraped the floor. It was Mr. Ellis, the family solicitor, rising from his seat near the end of the table. "I believe," he said gravely, "that Miss Wickham's letter to Mr. Ellery raised certain legal questions about the former steward's dismissal. As you all know, Lord Halverton now oversees all estate matters, including reparation claims." Eugenia laughed, harsh and brittle. "Reparation? To a maid?" "Not just to a maid," Ellis corrected. "To the daughter of a wrongfully dismissed steward. A man who was never given the opportunity to defend himself, and whose dismissal, it seems, was based on rumor rather than fact." The Countess stood abruptly. "Enough. This is a family matter." Ellis met her gaze. "Then it should have remained within the family." But it did not. "And now it concerns the law." Eugenia's voice trembled as she turned to the guests, appealing to them with wide, desperate eyes. "Surely you see what this is. A calculated move. She waited until now, days before the wedding, to dredge up the past, to humiliate me, to poison what we have." Lydia spoke once more. "I waited because I had no choice, until I saw that he kept the letter, until I knew that memory was not mine alone." Eugenia lunged forward, fury bright on her face, but the Countess stepped between them, hand raised. "You will not make a spectacle of yourself, Eugenia. You are still, until told otherwise, the future Duchess." That final phrase hung in the air, until told otherwise. And just then the Duke returned. He entered not from the grand doors but through the side passage, quietly, alone. His coat was unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. The room froze. He walked past the guests, past the still waiting plates and the broken glass, and stopped at Lydia's side. "I kept the letter," he said. It was not an apology, nor was it a declaration. It was simply truth. "And I have asked Mr. Ellery to investigate the nature of your father's dismissal. If there is cause for restitution, it shall be made. Publicly. Fully." Eugenia's voice cracked. "You're defending her?" "I am defending justice," he said softly, something this house has long ignored. Silence. The guests no longer smiled. They no longer touched their glasses. They only watched, each realizing that the power in the room had shifted. And it had not shifted toward the bride. The room did not recover. No amount of wine nor soft harpsichord notes hastily resumed in the adjoining salon could mend what had been fractured. The thread of ceremony had unraveled, and in its place hung something raw: humiliation, betrayal, grief, and the unbearable presence of memory made public. Eugenia did not sit again. She stood rooted in place, her cheeks bright with rage, her eyes wet but unshed. Her pride, so carefully arranged in lace and diamonds, now hung in tatters, invisible to all but felt by everyone. And yet, she would not cry. Not here. Not before them. She clutched the edge of the chair, her knuckles bone-white. "Is this how you repay me?" she whispered to Thomas, her voice trembling beneath its fury. "I was to be your Duchess. I carried your name on my tongue for months before you ever called on me." Thomas's face softened, but he did not reach for her. "I never meant for this to come forward like this," he said, "but I also never meant to forget what I did not have the courage to stop." The guests, sensing the intimacy of the moment, did not rise. They remained seated, still as portraits. None dared intervene. "You let her stay," Eugenia continued, her voice cracking. "You knew who she was, and still you let her dress me like I was nothing more than another gown to be folded and discarded. Was that the plan? To humiliate me in front of every titled fool in Hampshire?" "No," he answered. "I thought I could move forward without ever acknowledging the past. That was the real mistake." Across the room, the Countess lowered her eyes. A sigh left her, barely audible, but marked with a depth of resignation that comes only after years of watching the same sins play out in newer generations. Eugenia turned to Lydia then, and for the first time there was no mockery, no pretense of civility, only raw despair. "Why now?" she asked. "Why now, when everything was so perfectly arranged?" Lydia met her gaze calmly. "Because perfect arrangements are often made on the graves of others' silence." And that was the moment when something inside Eugenia collapsed. She did not scream. She did not curse. She simply folded. A single step backward, then another, her hand reaching behind to find the table edge, missing it, and then her knees gave. The footman moved too late. She crumpled like a porcelain figurine dropped from a child's hand. Gasps rose. Ladies stood. Someone called for water. A cousin ran for the physician. But Lydia did not move. She stood still, the storm of voices whirling around her like wind through the hedges. Her hands were steady, her heart loud in her ears, but even in its rhythm. Thomas crouched beside Eugenia, but she flinched at his touch. "I cannot breathe," she said faintly, clutching her chest. "You're overwrought," he murmured, but she shook her head, tears spilling now. "No, it's something else, something broken." A maid fetched smelling salts. The Countess helped ease Eugenia upright, her voice lowered and firm. "You'll retire to your room. We'll not allow the press to smell blood." Eugenia nodded faintly. She said nothing more. As they helped her to her feet and led her from the room, the hush lingered. Only when she had gone did the guests begin to murmur once more, their voices sharper now, less hushed, snippets of scandal already forming like cracks in porcelain. "Did you hear what she said? 16. A letter. All this time? Duke's fault, really." Lydia turned away before their eyes could land too heavily on her. She stepped back into the shadows where she had always stood. But this time it was not shame that led her there, it was clarity. The following morning, Halverton Hall held its breath. Rain swept across the moors beyond the orchard, pressing against the tall windows like a mourner at glass. Servants moved quietly, their steps more cautious than usual. The wedding was not cancelled, yet, but the chapel remained undecorated, the carriages unsummoned, and the floral arch at the gate sagged beneath the weight of storm and doubt. No announcement had been made, not formally, but silence had begun its slow work. In the stillness of her narrow room beneath the eaves, Lydia rose before dawn. Her bag was already packed, not with haste, but with the calm of a woman who had anticipated the need. A single dress, her mother's brooch, the letter from Thomas, unopened since the dinner, and one worn volume of Keats, the pages warped from a decade of rereading. She had dressed plainly, no mourning colours, no defiant scarlet, just the soft green wool her mother once embroidered at the hem. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror and saw not a servant, not a scandal, but a figure finally unhidden. It was enough. By 8, she had descended the servants' stair with no escort, no summons. But at the base of the steps, someone waited. Thomas. Not in formal dress, not with posture rehearsed for court or ceremony, just a man, damp at the collar, his hands ungloved. "You're leaving," he said. She met his eyes evenly. "There is no longer a role for me here." He stepped aside but did not move away. "You were never meant to stay invisible, Lydia. You made me invisible, years ago, when silence cost you nothing and cost me everything." He flinched, but did not deny it. "I know," he said. They stood for a moment in the hush of the corridor, the smell of coal and wet stone rising from the hearth. Outside a carriage waited, not the Duke's, but the modest hired one Lydia had sent for 2 nights earlier. She had not intended to use it. But foresight, she'd learned, was the only armor available to women without position. "Did you love me?" he asked suddenly. Lydia blinked, not out of surprise, but out of pain long endured. "I loved the boy who read poetry to me by firelight," she said. "But I do not know the man who let my father die in shame." Thomas reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I cannot stay," she added, "because if I do, I become a story told behind fans and folded letters, a scandal measured in whispers." "You are more than that," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, "and now you must live with that knowledge." She passed him then, the scent of rosemary and old ink still faint on her cloak. He did not follow. Outside the rain had ceased, though water still clung to the hedgerows like tears on lace. The driver tipped his hat. Lydia climbed into the carriage, her gloved hands steady, her spine straight. As the wheels turned and Halverton shrank behind her, she did not look back. Not until the house was nearly gone. Then, and only then, did she turn to the window, and there beneath the grand arch stood a figure, Thomas, alone, bareheaded, his coat dampened by the storm's final kiss. But he did not wave, and she did not cry. This was not a farewell dressed in romance. This was departure, quiet, final, deserved. For once, she was not being dismissed. She was choosing to leave, and all of Halverton, with its marble halls and hidden sins, could do nothing but watch. The rain did not return, but the silence remained. Halverton Hall, once bursting with preparations, now wore the hush of scandal like a second skin. The banners were taken down, the musicians paid and dismissed, and the kitchen fires, once roaring with urgency, simmered low, attended by staff who spoke in murmurs and walked as though afraid of waking the house itself. No wedding procession filled the chapel steps that Sunday. Instead, a sealed letter was delivered to the Rothshire estate, addressed in the Duke's own hand, bearing the formal regret that the union between His Grace, the Duke of Halverton, and Miss Eugenia Claremont was indefinitely postponed due to matters of legal and personal gravity. The Claremonts did not respond. By Monday morning, Eugenia had returned to Hampshire. Her trunks were packed by strangers, her exit unceremonious. She had not spoken to Thomas again. She had not asked for Lydia. Her name was not uttered beyond the door of her chamber, and her scent, violets and champagne, was swiftly replaced by lavender and starch. In the West Wing, the Countess ordered the staff ledger revised. Lydia Wickham's name was removed, her quarters inventory reissued, her duties reassigned. A new maid arrived within the week, young, eager, unaware. But the room beneath the eaves was kept empty for days, as if memory needed space to linger before erasure could be complete. Thomas did not resume public appearances. He cancelled the estate's midsummer dinner, refused all invitations to London, and was last seen walking the orchard paths alone, his boots caked in damp soil. Servants noted the way he carried a letter in his breast pocket, sometimes touching it absently, as if to remind himself it was still there. Mr. Ellery's office sent correspondence, polite, precise. An inquiry had been launched into the steward's dismissal. Testimonies were taken, quietly but not without consequence. The butler, long assumed loyal, was found to have destroyed records at the late Duke's instruction. He resigned. A coachman admitted to hearing the elder Duke refer to Lydia as the girl who looked too boldly at boys with titles, a cruel phrase now etched into the estate's unseen annals. And Thomas, no longer shielded by youth or by ignorance, signed documents that reversed his father's judgment. Restitution was issued to the Wickham family's remaining kin, small, symbolic, but public. Halverton Hall did not make a declaration, it simply shifted. One painting of the late Duke was removed from the corridor leading to the study. A new steward was hired, not by name but by vote among the senior staff, the first such appointment in Halverton history. Letters arrived from guests of the ill-fated dinner, some polite, some cruel. One referred to Lydia as the quiet girl who stood tall while everyone else sat in judgment. That letter was burned by Thomas late one evening, with no witnesses. And in the village, the gossip flowed like tea. Some said she'd planned it all, from first stitch to last letter. Others said she had bewitched the Duke. A few remembered her as the steward's daughter, who once wept beside her father's grave with her face in her hands, a child ruined too early by men who never paid the price for what they took. But none forgot. Because Lydia had not shouted, she had not begged, she had simply stood. And the room, every titled guest, every polished fork, every inch of marble, had tilted to meet her stillness. It would not be undone. Not with time, not with silence, not even with new lace and a new bride. The house itself had remembered. Autumn came early that year, with winds that bent the orchard trees and reddened the hedgerows before September had properly taken root. The leaves on the linden trees curled inwards, as though they too remembered the weight of a name once whispered and now absent. In the village, Lydia's name was no longer spoken aloud in shop queues or beside parish pews, but her shadow lingered in every conversation that turned to Halverton. When a young governess dropped a tray in the drawing-room and was not scolded, the housekeeper merely said, "Let it be," and others understood why. When a visiting cousin asked which room had once belonged to the scandal, the footman replied only, "She isn't here," and the question never came again. Lydia herself had taken a position in Oxfordshire, assisting with archival records at a solicitor's estate. Quiet work, unglamorous, but chosen. She wore simple gloves, walked each morning past a rose garden of fading bloom and spoke little of her past. There she was not the steward's daughter, not the lady's maid who undid a wedding. She was Miss Wickham, a woman with an excellent eye for detail and a silence that commanded respect. She did not write to Thomas, he wrote once, weeks after her departure. The letter arrived in a plain envelope with no crest. Inside, he had written only, "You were right, about the silence, about the cost. I will carry it," she did not reply. Not out of cruelty, but because there are debts that cannot be settled with ink. There are reckonings that must be lived, not answered. And yet, when she passed a particular garden gate each morning, the one where the hawthorn bloomed thick and white, she sometimes thought of the letter he had kept, the boy he had been, the girl she once was. She did not regret leaving. She regretted only that no one had stood beside her sooner. Years later, a new duchess would arrive at Halverton, a distant French noble's daughter, with no connection to the Claremonts, no memory of scandal. She would refurbish the east wing, paint the ballroom in new colors, and commission a marble statue for the garden. A woman cloaked, head bowed, one hand pressed to her chest. Who is she meant to be? Guests would ask. The Duke never answered, but the servants called her Lydia. And though no formal portrait of Miss Wickham ever hung in the house, her presence remained in the hush of library corridors, in the quiet hush that fell whenever memory flickered too close to the surface. And in one drawer of the Duke's writing desk, long after the ink had dried and the dust had settled, there remained a single letter, never opened, never discarded. Her hand, her seal, her silence. No one dared mention her name again, but every room remembered her.